Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is July 20, 2022, and it's time to resume our COVID-19 update series. The USA is currently surging. Joe Biden, when he was running for president, said as part of his stump speech, quote, "I'm not going to shut down the country, I'm going to shut down the virus." Well, no, that's kind of the same thing, because ending viral transmission is a difficult thing with a currently mutated virus that is about as contagious as any virus known to humanity. The Delta strain from last year, 2021, was significantly more contagious than original COVID. Omicron was more contagious than Delta, and each subsequent Omicron family strain, that would be BA.2, BA.4, BA.5, has been about 20 to 25% more contagious than the last. So while the severity has not dramatically increased, which is a good thing, the contagiousness certainly has. And what happens when you just let a virus like this keep spreading and spreading and spreading? Well, it mutates, because how do mutations happen? They happen during transmission. The genetic sequences get mixed up sometimes, or if you have more than one strain in your body, you can get a recombinant strain, where different pieces of the genetic material from both strains wind up merging. And if you look at Omicron, we were having like 1 million cases a day for a while. That's a lot of transmission, that's a lot of mutation, that's a lot of dice rolls as far as, is it going to mutate this time? Is it going to mutate this time? And just repeat, trillions of times, like there's a lot of virus going on. So currently, Delta is about the high water mark of the severity of the virus. But that could change, because what's happening is, although the impact of COVID is not significantly different than it's been for, about the past year, or at least since the winter, the contagiousness is up, and the immune evasiveness is also up. We've covered this in previous live streams. What does that mean? It means that whether you had antibodies from a previous infection, or whether you had antibodies from a vaccination, the new strains, BA.4 and BA.5 in particular, are very likely to be able to avoid and throw off those antibodies. This immune evasion process can occur in a number of ways. One of the ways that we've seen is mutations, specifically shape changes in the virus on the sites of the virus where the antibodies usually attach to the virus. So in other words, the antibody goes to grab the virus in a particular location. If the virus mutates so that the thing that the antibody is trying to grab onto is no longer there, or it's a different shape, or it's not as sticky, whatever, then the antibody is going to be less effective. That's one of the things that we're seeing here. So currently, it's much more contagious. It's about as severe as it's been for the last, 9 months or so. The problem is, what happens when it mutates again? Because remember, one day Delta wasn't there, and then it was. And one day Omicron wasn't there, and then it was. And then it outcompetes the previous strains go extinct, and then you're dealing with a new virus. So the short-term thinking is ridiculous, because one day you'll be dealing with a virus that has a certain mortality or fatality rate, and that causes a certain amount of morbidity or sickness. And then one day you're dealing with a different virus, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So what happens if the virus mutates, and suddenly we have a 10 or 20% mortality rate, or a 50%, or it becomes so immune evasive that really nothing can treat it? These are not situations we want to find out the answers to the hard way. These are situations we want to avoid. And let's be very clear, why isn't more being done about this? Why is the U.S., for example, and other countries in the imperialist U.S. orbit, why are they all folding up their public health response and, just basically saying the pandemic is over, when it's literally the exact opposite of over? It's not endemic. There's gigantic spikes that are several times larger. Both the Omicron spike and the current BA.2 and BA.4, BA.5 spikes are significantly larger than anything we had in the first 2 years. That's the opposite of being over. That's called being much, much worse. So yeah, pandemic is still going. It's worse than ever. Why the short-term thinking? Very simple answer. Capitalism. The system is not going to tell you that, so we have to explain that to people, because the system is not going to. It's capitalism. That's why they're basically just declaring the pandemic over when it is in fact worse than ever. And it stands to get worse if the virus keeps mutating. Will the virus keep mutating? Well, that's what it's been doing this whole time. We have no reason to think that it's going to stop now. This is just kind of basic biology and epidemiology. So as far as Biden, I'm not going to shut down the country. I'm going to shut down the virus. Well, the vaccine-only strategy has not worked. We need, at a minimum, mask mandates, and specifically N95 or better mask mandates. The cloth really don't do anything. And the surgical masks, again, not really. They have the big open gaps on the side of the face. So, this is an airborne disease. It is spread through aerosol particles. Those are just escaping out the sides. So we need N95 or better masks. We need them mandated. We need them given out to people for free. And we also need to stop undercounting the cases, which is going on because of rapid testing. You can see in the graphic, the wastewater charts are going, up sharply. The cases are not. Why? Because the cases just aren't being counted anymore. So with the case count being swept under the rug and few people at this point being aware of alternative ways of tracking it, such as the wastewater, which is a leading rather than a lagging indicator. Roughly in order, the first alert you're going to get is in the wastewater because somebody gets COVID. It multiplies in their body, it's excreted out through their waste, and then it shows up in the sewage, which is monitored for COVID and for many other things. Then cases. But again, the cases are going to be diminished. A lot of people are not getting PCR tests. And then even some of those who do, it doesn't get reported due to various standards of the public health agencies in the U.S. So the case count is way underreported. Following that, the next lagging indicator is hospitalizations because it takes a while for COVID to hit you hard enough that you need to be hospitalized. Finally, deaths. It takes a few weeks usually for COVID to kill someone, so that's going to show up, 3 weeks late, something like that, after the surge has already broken out. So know your indicators and follow something like biobot.io, biobot.io/data is the page where they have all the charts that I regularly show in the S4A live streams and in this video. All right, so we're in a surge. It is going up sharply. We can expect it to continue. And it's the second biggest surge of the entire pandemic after Omicron. Okay, that's bad. The fact that this is happening in the middle of summer, it pretty much is nonstop. We had the Omicron wave, then people had temporary, 1 or 2 or 3 month immunity after that, and then people started getting reinfected with BA.2. That's what caused that plateau that you see there in March into April, May, and June. That plateau is being driven, or was being driven, by BA.2 and related subvariants. Now, the current sharp increase that we're seeing after months of plateau, that is the result of BA.4 and BA.5 coming in. Now, BA.4 and BA.5 are the major statement that COVID is making right now, but it's not the final word. For example, there is COVID BA.2.75 that is just fresh from causing a lot of havoc in India. Cases are being discovered in the U.S. now. That may be the next thing. And as we're going to read in an article in this video, it's probably the last one we're going to do in this video, BA.2.75 seems to be very resistant to monoclonal antibody treatments, which is one of the main things that they give people in the hospital to neutralize the infection. So if you think that the, quote, supply chain is fucked up right now, you ain't seen nothing yet. This thing is going to bring the economy to a halt because the variants are just going to keep coming. That's actually the first article that we're going to do in this video, is about how new variants every couple of months, each one worse than the last, is what the, quote, normal of just letting COVID rip. That's what happens, okay? We've been saying that at this channel for quite a while now. If you just let it rip, it does not end. It just gets worse. So that's going to keep going. Number two, we're going to read an article, or rather a white paper, about long COVID comorbidities. So what is that? Morbidity is sickness, so COVID increases your odds of getting all kinds of other things. And the symptoms of long COVID, which not everybody gets, but a substantial portion of people do get long COVID, it can be really debilitating stuff. And we're seeing more people out of the workforce right now who otherwise would be working because they're disabled by long COVID. I had long COVID myself. I absolutely could not think straight for about a year. And it was very hard to concentrate on things for more than about 10 seconds at a time. I I came out of it after about a year, but it was significant impairment that combined with fatigue and shortness of breath, I would say were some of my main symptoms, although COVID-induced immune dysfunction is another thing. It severely affects your T cells, depleting them, and may cause increases long-term in cancer rates. We may see that go up because your T cells help to keep cancer from turning into a thing in your body. If they're depleted from COVID, that could lead to runaway processes, getting started and really having nothing stopping them in your body. And, beyond that, just being more susceptible to other diseases. So one of my questions about the monkeypox situation, which is, again, rapidly growing, showing increasing rates of growth as it goes on, is this caused in part by COVID-related immune dysfunction? I don't know, but it seems possible to me. So that's number 2, is effects of long COVID, because I think, somebody asked me recently, how do we get people to think about this appropriately? And I said, one of the main things is COVID is not just about death. It's not just the mortality rate. There are significant symptoms for a substantial, like 20-30% of the population, when it comes to long COVID. And if you get hospitalized with COVID, if your infection is that bad in the first place, then you're much more likely, your odds about double to 50 or 60% likelihood of getting long COVID, because it's doing massive inflammatory damage throughout your body, in your brain, in your heart, in your liver, in your immune system, in your lungs, in your kidneys, major vital organs. That's not the kind of thing you want. When you read about people trying to eat more vegetables and fruits and less meat and stuff like that, inflammation is one of the things that you're trying to avoid. You have all the antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds, whereas the meats tend to have the opposite. That's a sort of wellness thing for long-term chronic, not infectious disease-related health concerns. Now we're getting a virus circulating that can, according to a study covered in National Geographic, cause a decade's worth of aging damage in your brain and brain shrinkage. And we're just told to forget it like it's nothing at all. Crazy stuff. So thinking about long COVID and the damage that even a, quote, mild upfront infection, in that first month, the acute phase, you may not be hospitalized. You may not even have bad symptoms then. But as I like to tell people, which is true, by the way, I don't just like to tell them it, HIV also starts with, quote, flu-like symptoms. Then down the line, you find that your immune system is turned upside down. Now, COVID and HIV are not exactly identical, but we will be doing in a separate video. We'll have many of these update videos, I think, in the next couple of weeks, because I've collected several dozen articles that I think are worth sharing. We'll see that the effects on T cells are pretty dramatic. And so what does this do 5 years from now? We don't know yet, but right now the CDC is encouraging people to shrug this off like it's nothing. When they reduced the quarantine period from 10 days to 5, this was a good sign that capitalism had just simply hit its limit. And they're not going to say that, so we have to point out the link to the economic system, which is all about short-term profits, not long-term planning. It's all about centering capital, not people. That's why we're in this situation. Lastly, we are going to look at a third article about the BA.2.75 variant, which may be the next thing to think about on the horizon after BA.4 and BA.5, which are two closely related variants driving the current surge. But again, BA.4 and BA.5, this surge just started about 2 weeks ago, so we have a lot more to come from what is already ahead of us, regardless of what happens with 2.75. All right, that said, as an intro, let's get into the 3 articles, and yes, I will be timestamping this so that everybody can, get to the info that they're looking for most. Okay, so the first article we're going to look at is titled, "The BA.5 Wave is What COVID Normal Looks Like. The Endless Churn of Variants May Not Stop Anytime Soon, Unless We Do Something About It," by Katherine J. Wu. We've covered articles from her before, and I just want to say, may not stop. That is technically true. I would upgrade that to, we have no reason to think it would stop. It could stop due to some miracle, but that's not scientific thinking to rely on, maybe some completely freak thing could occur that is statistically very unlikely that we've seen no evidence of. So I think that, saying something like the endless churn of variants is not likely to stop anytime soon. We have no reason to think it will stop anytime soon unless we do something about it. In other words, we need to stop the transmission. So anyway, this article is dated July 14, 2022, and it goes like this. After 2+ years of erupting into distinguishable peaks, the U.S. coronavirus case curve has a new topography, a long, never-ending plateau. Waves are now so frequent that they're colliding and uplifting like tectonic plates, the valleys between them filling with virological rubble. With cases quite high, but still drastically undercounted, and hospitalizations lilting up, this lofty mesa is a disconcerting place to be. The subvariants keep coming. Immunity is solid against severe disease, but porous to infection and the resulting chaos. Comment. Immunity is solid against severe disease. People need to stop thinking about mortality during the acute phase as the only concern. We have been trying to hammer this home in our COVID updates. I guess Katherine J. Wu either didn't listen or, whatever. But point is, we have a lot of articles that we're seeing now and will be covered in near future COVID update videos about how reinfections seem to up the odds of morbidity every time. So saying something like immunity is solid against severe disease is really misleading. It makes people think, oh, well, I've had it twice in the last year. I can get it again. It's not going to kill me. No, because the systemic damage that the reinfections are doing is quite likely increasing your risks of other symptoms, not just death, but you could be shaving years off of your life every time that you get reinfected. So very misleading there. Anyway, some people are getting the virus for the first time, others for the second, third, or more, occasionally just weeks apart, and we could remain at this elevation for some time. So comment again, I mentioned the immune evasiveness. When she says occasionally just weeks apart, that is true. It used to be that if you got, the original strain, you would be protected. You would have functioning antibodies for like 8 or 9 months. Now, because new variants are replacing each other every 2 months, and not even just because of that, but because also you can get reinfected with the same strain. Each of the Omicron family strains that we've been dealing with for the last 8 months or whatever, they can even evade your existing antibodies against that strain better, and all the more so if you catch, BA.4 when you previously had BA.2. So that's why people are getting reinfected weeks or, 1 to 2 months apart. The risk of reinfection now is a completely different ballgame from just 2 or even 1 year ago. So this is why we can't just let it rip. You wind up with a changing situation. It doesn't respect your need for short-term profits. It doesn't respect your need to keep Dunkin' Donuts running. It's a virus. You can't negotiate with it. You have to deal with it on its terms, like a fire or any other natural disaster. Continuing. Coronavirus test positivity trends, for instance, look quite bad. A rate below 5% might have once indicated a not too bad level of infection. But, quote, I wake up every morning and look and it's 20% again, says Pavitra Roy-Chaudhry, a viral genomicist at the University of Washington, who's tracking SARS coronavirus 2 cases in her community. Quote, the last time we were below 10% was the first week of April, unquote. It's not clear, Roy-Chaudhry told me, when the next downturn might be. So comment, the test positivity, you can go to the Johns Hopkins coronavirus tracker to see that. I haven't even looked in a while because I know what it's going to be. For reference on that, the WHO said back in 2020, when everyone was doing a shutdown, even the United States, and a half-assed one, and not very well implemented one at that, but they were doing something. And by the way, those work. The test positivity, if it went over 5%, that was supposed to be the trigger for a shutdown. And it was supposed to stay below 5% for 2 weeks before reopening. They have completely thrown that out the window. So all the stuff back in 2020 about, report COVID-19 misinformation and this and that, and, oh, are you questioning the World Health Organization? It has gone out the fucking window. And that's how deeply, this country values public health information for real. It was real serious for a while when they felt like recognizing it. Now, nothing has fundamentally changed. If anything, things have fundamentally changed to be more serious, more concerning. And yet, that has triggered them just completely abandoning any real effort at stopping it. And as far as, people spreading, quote, misinformation, look around. The CDC is right at the top of the list. Fauci saying that and Fauci's not part of the CDC, but right up there in the, upper echelon of public health personnel in this country. Fauci was just saying that we're, quote, out of the pandemic phase. Excuse me, what? The pandemic is literally worse than ever. Continuing. Part of this relentless churn of new variants is about the speed of the virus. SARS coronavirus 2, repped by the Omicron clan, could you please turn down the lingo? It's a bit overwritten, is now spewing out globe-sweeping subvariants at a blistering clip. In the United States, the fall of BA.2 and BA.2.75 have overlapped so tightly with the rise of BA.5 that the peaks of their surges have blended into one. That's what I was showing on the wastewater chart before. It's just a long plateau that then upticks, and that's where BA.4 and BA.5 come in. And a new ominous cousin, BA.2.75, is currently popping in several parts of the world. At the same time, our counter moves are sluggish at best. I'm sorry, there are no counter moves. The U.S. Congress just refused to fund part of the monoclonal antibodies thing. Vaccines are no longer cost-free for uninsured people. This is ridiculous. Counter moves, please. Pathogens don't spread or transform without first inhabiting hosts. But with masks, distancing, travel restrictions, and other protective measures almost entirely vanished. Quote, "We've given the virus every opportunity to keep doing this," says David Martinez, a viral immunologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. More variants mean more infections. More infections mean more variants, because that's where it mutates, in people's bodies, while it's replicating. It's true that, compared with earlier in the pandemic, hospitalization and death rates remain relatively low, but a high rate of infections is keeping us in the vicious viral evolution cycle. Quote, "The main thing is really this unchecked transmission," says Helen Chu, an epidemiologist and vaccine expert at the University of Washington. "We might be ready to get back to normal and forget the virus exists." Again, this push is being driven by the short-term needs for profit of the capitalist system that we're in. But without doing something about infection or transmission, spread, we can't slow the COVID treadmill that we found ourselves on. By the way, one other comment about the mortality coming down, where they say that it's true that compared with earlier in the pandemic, hospitalization and death rates remain relatively low. Part of that is because people have the vaccine immunity or they have the immunity from a previous infection. Part of it is because the most susceptible people are simply dead now. Remember that 1 million people in the U.S. alone have died. The speed at which a virus shapeshifts hinges on two main factors: the microbe's inherent capacity for change and the frequency with which it interacts with hospitable hosts. Coronaviruses don't tend to mutate terribly quickly compared with other RNA viruses, and for the first year or so of the pandemic, SARS coronavirus 2 stuck to that stereotype, picking up roughly 2 mutations a month. But then came Alpha, Delta, Omicron, and its many subvariants, and SARS coronavirus 2 began to outstrip the abilities of even flu viruses to birth versions of itself that vaccinated and previously infected bodies can't easily recognize. BA.1, in other words Omicron, sported dozens of typos in its genome. BA.2 was able to rise quickly after, in part because it carried its own set of changes, sufficient to stump even some of the defenses that its predecessor had raised. The story was similar with BA.2.12.1, and then again with BA.4 and BA.5, the wonkiest looking versions of the virus that have risen to prominence to date. Nothing yet suggests that SARS coronavirus 2 has juiced up its ability to mutate, but subvariants are slamming us faster because, from the virus's perspective, quote, "There's more immune pressure now," says Katja Coel, an evolutionary virologist at Emory University. Early on in the pandemic, the virus's primary need was speed. To find success, a variant, quote, "just had to get to somebody first," says Verity Hill, a viral genomicist at Yale. Alpha was such a revision, quicker than the original coronavirus at invading our airways, better at latching onto cells. Delta was more fleet-footed still, but a virus can only up its transmissibility so much, says Emma Hodcroft, a viral phylogeneticist at the University of Bern. To keep infecting people beyond that, SARS coronavirus 2 needed to get stealthier. With most of the world now at least partially protected against the virus, thanks to a slew of infections and shots, immune evasion is, quote, the only way that a new variant can really spread, Hill told me. And because even well-defended bodies had not been able to fully prevent infection and transmission, SARS coronavirus 2 has had ample opportunity to invade and find genetic combinations that help it slither around their safeguards. That same modus operandi sustains flu viruses, norovirus, and other coronaviruses, which repeatedly reinfect individuals, Coel told me. It has also defined the Omicron oligarchy, and, quote, the longer the Omicron dominance continues, Hill told me, the more difficult it will be for another variant to usurp its throne. It's unclear why this particular variant has managed a monopoly. It may have to do with the bendability of the Omicron shapes, which seem particularly adept at sidestepping antibodies without compromising their ability to infect our cells. Scientists also suspect that at least one Omicron reservoir, a highly infected community, a chronically infected individual, Bolsonaro, or a coronavirus-vulnerable animal, may be repeatedly slingshotting out new subvariants, fueling a rush of tsunami-caliber waves. Whatever its secret, Team Omicron has clearly spread far and wide. Trevor Bedford, who studies viral evolution at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, estimates that roughly 50% of the U.S. may have been infected by early members of the BA group in the span of just a few months. Each encounter has offered the virus countless opportunities to mutate further. And if there's a limit to the virus's ability to reconfigure its genome and elude our antibodies again, quote, we haven't detected it yet, Martinez of UNC Chapel Hill told me. Such malleability has precedent. Versions of the H3N2 flu virus that have been bopping around since the 60s are still finding new ways to reinvade us. With SARS coronavirus 2, the virus immunity arms race could go on, quote, very, very long, Coel told me. To circumvent immunity, she says, quote, a virus only has to be different than it was previously. So more variants will arise. That much is inevitable. The rate at which they appear is not. 3 things, Coel told me, could slow SARS coronavirus 2's spread. First, the virus's genome could get, quote, a little more brittle and less accepting of mutations, she said. Maybe, for instance, the microbe's ability to switch up its surface will hit some sort of ceiling, but Coel thinks it's unwise to count on that. I would second that. Instead, we, the virus's hosts, could give it fewer places to reproduce by bolstering immunity and curbing infections. On the immunity front, the world's nowhere yet near saturated. Infections will continue and make the average person on Earth a crummier place to land. I have to say, leading with that sentence is a horrible idea. You're basically promoting herd immunity. What's the problem with that? You're also, every time you do that, letting the virus mutate more. So herd immunity comes at the cost not only of massive systemic inflammatory damage in major organs like the brain. Every time there's a natural infection, there's also the potential for lots of mutations to be tried out in the body. So please, this herd immunity shit, it hasn't worked. That's why we're where we're at 2.5 years later, with a worse virus, with bigger spikes, with a plateau and a spike in the middle of the spring and summer. This is getting worse, not better. So please stop. Anyway, better yet, yeah, you think you should have maybe led with this. Vaccinations will shore up our defenses. And we need better vaccines, to be honest, because the ones we have, while useful, are outdated. They only protect against now extinct strains, which, yes, have some things in common with the current strains. I know that Walter Reed Hospital was working on basically like, I said before it was like a D20, like a 20-sided die. It's actually a D24, which each of the 24 sides had like a different variant of the spike protein on it. So basically this vaccine would immunize you against all kinds of different strains potentially. That was announced last year, and over a year later, I can't find really anything about it. So it seems like the entire push to vaccinate people has just completely gone off. And as we discussed in a live stream, the people promoting very ignorantly some kind of like eugenicist, let the people who get it, This actually, from a sort of, we're thinning the herd or, culling out the weak kind of mentality is counterproductive, because what you're going to get is maybe not as many people dying, but more people becoming disabled. So if you're trying to have a population of, Ubermenschen, like superheroes who are invulnerable to the, problems of mere mortals, this is not, this is taking you further away from that direction, because about, roughly 20% of people who get infected get some significant, at least medium-term disabilities. So anyway, billions of people, continuing, have now received at least one dose of a COVID-19 shot, but there are still large pockets of individuals, especially in low-income countries, who have no shots at all. Even among the vaccinated, far too few people have had the 3, 4, or even 5 injections necessary to stave off the worst damage of Omicron and its offshoots. Simply getting people up to date would increase protection, as could variant-specific updates to vaccine recipes, just talking about, likely due soon in the US and European Union. But the appetite for additional shots has definitely ebbed, especially in the US. Depends which demographic you're looking at, but anyway. Retooled recipes also won't see equitable distribution around the globe. They may even end up as a stopgap, offering only temporary protection until the virus, quote, gets pushed to a new point on its evolutionary map and circumvents us again, Hill said. So let me just comment on that. Yes, as we mentioned, the current strains, BA.4 and BA.5, which are dominant, are the most immune evasive to date. That means even if you were vaccinated, you're more protected than if you weren't, but you are less protected than you would have been from the same shot, walking out of the clinic newly vaccinated a year ago, because it's a new virus. And let's remember also, is the coverage from a vaccine, is the protection that a vaccine confers permanent? No, it is not. We know damn well that it wanes after about 4, 5, 6 months. That's why they were talking about a getting the booster shots, a revaccination schedule. Currently in the US, you're only approved to get a second booster shot if you're over 50 years old. So what does that mean for somebody like me, who is not 50 years old? I got my booster shot back in December. That coverage is probably gone. That was 7 months ago. So I'm one of the people who still masks, and I avoid every public gathering that I possibly can. But when I go buy food at a supermarket, I do wear a mask, and I take all that very seriously. If you wash your hands, you got to wash them with water that is as hot as you can tolerate, and for 20 to 30 seconds. If you've ever worked in the food service industry, you know that the training is sing happy birthday several times, but you can't just a lot of people put soap on their hands and they use very lukewarm water, and it's 5 or 10 seconds. You're not really cleaning your hands thoroughly or properly at that point. You're probably getting rid of something, but not everything. So yeah, I take every measure that I can to protect myself, but all it takes is once and you're done. You're infected. So I'm, very vulnerable in terms of my immunity. I believe I have had COVID before, but that was over a year and a half ago. And my booster shot is probably worn off. And so now I'm just exposed to a virus that, like many people, I'm just exposed to a virus that is way more contagious, way more severe than original COVID. And to be honest, original COVID, if that's what it is, I didn't have a positive test, but I'm pretty sure it was based on the symptoms, completely knocked me on my ass and gave me long COVID for a year. So, this whole everybody just walking around like nothing's wrong, it's certainly concerning. I don't want to be disabled for a year again, plus, whatever that is shaving off of my overall lifespan. But then finally, this whole question of vaccines around the world, they never removed the intellectual property and patent kind of stuff. So there's a lot of countries that have just really never gotten a proper amount of vaccines, and doesn't look like that is a priority. We're now 2.5 years into this. The conversation has stopped. So what we really need is global containment and vaccination for, anything that slips through. The vaccine is really your last line of defense. It's after you've gotten infected. The overwhelming majority of the protections should be preventing infection in the first place. So China, for example, has been taking this seriously. Whether they're socialist or not, obviously the audience is very split on that. That's fine. But they are taking this seriously. And it is because they're not just on a completely neoliberal system where, profit is 1 through 9 on the list of priorities, as it is in the US and the EU and things like that. So capitalism is basically just saying, and you might say, is it fair to call it capitalism? Yes, because, for example, well, that's who rules the world. But Joe Biden's COVID czar, a guy named Jeff Zients, Zients, he's the COVID czar. Is his background in public health? Is it in medicine? Is he a doctor even? No. His background is he's from Bain Capital, corporate raiders, vulture capitalists, basically the firm that Obama ran against in 2012 because it's where Mitt Romney was from. That's who's been running Biden's COVID response. So yeah, it's fair to say that this is the needs of the big capitalists explicitly and absolutely that are being expressed in these COVID denialist policies. It's coming from Rochelle Walensky at the CDC, who used to be a good COVID warrior until, Biden got in and it's like, here are the marching orders, and she changed her tune real quick. Here's the thing though, this is a biological reality. I compared it, to like a forest fire before. You can't negotiate with it, and it just does the damage that it does. We were talking about the supply chain before and people being out of work. This is really going to fuck up capitalism, even in the medium term. So I don't really know what their plan is, because this is really going to hurt their own system. Their relentless insistence on the short-term profit priority. I know that it's a constraint of capitalism, whatever ideology you would like to, try to overlay on that. It's the material reality of capitalism's needs, but they're unwilling to even attempt simple reforms at this point. I just don't know what they're going to substitute for that when the fallout inevitably hits, as it's already starting to do. I mean, if the current indications are anything to go on, they're going to just keep scapegoating all kinds of other, people and interests, everybody but those who actually made these policies. So I guess expect a lot more scapegoating to come, but again, it's going to be on us to point out this is capitalism. They're never going to cop to it. Anyway, continuing, which leaves us with coordinated behavioral change. Oh, public health interventions. Amazing. A strategy that exactly no one feels optimistic about, except for people who understand it and that it works, etc. So exactly no one feels optimistic about is bullshit. Maybe nobody at the upper levels of power, maybe Jeff Zients doesn't feel optimistic about it because of, how it could curtail capitalist growth in the short term. But really, people who understand public health, the kind of people who should be running the public health response, feel very optimistic about it because it works. Don't know what else to say. It works. There's evidence-based practices that we know can slow and stop transmission. Anyway, precautionary policies are gone. Several governments are focused on counting hospitalizations and deaths, allowing infections to skyrocket as long as the healthcare system stays intact. And might I say, good fucking luck with that, because some of the most traumatized people walking around in the US right now are healthcare workers who quit their jobs in 2020 and 2021 because of witnessing what has been happening in the medical system during that time. There were already shortages of key healthcare workers, such as nurses, prior to the pandemic. Now, people have been quitting in droves. So, is it going to stay intact? Well, all we need is that mutation that even increases mortality to 5%, and the system is going to come down like a house of cards, to be honest. Quote, everyone just wants some sense of normalcy, UW's Roy Chowdhury said. This, I have to say, just this endless masturbation to the idea of normalcy. If this is all the U.S. is good for, and it seems to be, then this system is not going to survive. This entire, not just capitalism itself, but the entire cultural and social system that has been erected in the United States is going to just collapse during this pandemic, because if you cannot tolerate interruptions in people's sense of immediate gratification, like that level of convenience satisfaction, if you can't tolerate even like a 2-week interruption in, oh, I can't get my hair cut, etc., if your economy is based on restaurants not being able to survive 3 or 4 weeks of closure, then your whole system was just shaky as hell to begin with. But on a cultural level and an ideological level, what people have been indoctrinated with so thoroughly is just this idea of like everything is instant, everything's on demand, everything is exactly the way that you want it. This egocentric environment where just nothing is like even slightly out of step with your whims and desires. Your expectations are so grotesquely distorted, reliant on so much class exploitation and resource consumption that, again, that's the system. That is the disgusting reality of the United States and any other country that has sort of emulated it. So everyone just wants some sense of normalcy, and they're willing to have 1 million people die in the process to just keep questing after furiously, frantically, fanatically that, quote, sense of normalcy. The back to normal thing, I'm sorry, if you can't survive an interruption in, quote, normal, especially when normal is so incredibly artificial to begin with, your idea of what is normal, what you've allowed yourself to be led to believe is normal as a grown-ass human, then your system deserves to fail because emergencies happen in the world, disasters happen in the world. And what is the point of building civilization at all, if not to improve our capacity to deal with it? And that's certainly not what this system is about. This system, capitalism, is about increasing the ability of a tiny minority exploiting class to more and more profoundly exploit the growing working class. So we'll see what happens in the coming years, but capitalism is definitely taking some major knocks, is going to come out of this with some major black eyes, maybe missing a limb or two. And it is going to be on socialists to agitate, educate, and organize against it. The system, no matter how bad it gets, is not going to fall on its own. It has to be pushed. And we need more and more thousands, millions, tens of millions of people who are going to be able to give it that push and then start building a new system afterwards. Continuing, even many people who consider themselves quite COVID conscious have picked up old social habits again. Quote, "The floodgates just opened this year," Martinez said. Yeah, and that was all encouraged directly by the government. He too has eased up a bit in recent months, wearing a mask less often at small gatherings with friends, and more often bowing to peer pressure to take the face covering off. Well, honestly, you deserve what you get. If you know better and you're doing that anyway, fuck you. You're making it harder for all of us. And we don't deserve what you're making possible. A.J. Sethi, an infectious disease epidemiologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, still works at home and avoids eating with strangers indoors. Good for you. He masks in crowded places, but at home, as contractors remodel his bathrooms, he has decided not to. A pivot from last year. Okay, I mean, you know, why would you go through all that effort there and then not when, like, there's people in your house, you're bringing the public place to you? What's the point of that? But this is the kind of cognitive dissonance you see being exhibited right now. And I'll grant you this, it is difficult to keep up the militants. It's difficult to keep it up. But that's where, a we're all in this together mentality helps. People need to be encouraged in that. People need to be reminded, hey, we know it's hard. It's hard for us too, but we got to keep it up. And that's how more people can find the strength to do it. But we all know that the United States has no real solidarity within it. There's no real bonding. It's a profit venture loosely stitched together on people's mutual interest in going to the mall. That's the disgusting bourgeois individualized consciousness that has been created in most of the people socialized in this country. As socialists, we're trying to build something different, a collective sense of solidarity based on class with respect for people of all different ethnic, racial, gender, and other backgrounds, standing together not just against class exploitation, but also against bigotry that oppresses along these other social status lines. Does this country's left have what it takes to build that? A large, strong fighting movement of the poor and oppressed against the rich and bigoted? Time will tell, but the opportunities are here, and there's nothing to be gained by waiting. Continuing, his chances of suffering from the virus haven't changed much. What has is, quote, probably more of my own fatigue, he told me, quote, and my willingness to accept more risk than before, unquote. So why? Like, what? Why are you willing to accept more risk than before? Just fatigue? Again, we could combat that fatigue by a better campaign of encouragement, support, rallies, etc., that would put spring back in people's step while, trying to suffer through what is, it's inconvenient. It's a hassle. It's a nuisance. But we're trying to protect each other's lives, not give each other a very dangerous virus, which again always has the chance of becoming a more dangerous virus if we keep letting it spread. Basic public health failure. The global situation has, to be fair, immensely improved. No, it hasn't. Vaccines and treatments have slashed the proportion of people who are ending up seriously sick and dead, even when case rates climb. Again, a lot of the most vulnerable people have already died, and what kind of medium and long-term problems is COVID causing? There's no real mention of that in this article. And the virus's pummel should continue to soften. Excuse me, no, that's misinformation. Hill told me as global immunity grows. Again, immunity is temporary. We're talking about people now getting infected a month or 2 or 3 after getting infected, with Omicron or one of these things. That simply wasn't the case before. So the virus is becoming more immune evasive. Is that immunity growing or lessening? Chu of the University of Washington is also optimistic that SARS coronavirus 2 will eventually, like flu, there is nothing about this that is like the flu, nothing, and other coronaviruses adhere to some seasonality, becoming a threat that can be managed with an annually updated shot. Well, right now it's doing the exact opposite. We're seeing, obviously, a massive spike in the winter, which dwarfed all of the previous spikes. That was Omicron. And now we're having a huge plateau and spiking in the seasons where people's health is generally much better, spring and summer. So we see no evidence of that right now, so I'd really like to know what the proposed mechanism is. But the degree to which the COVID situation improves and when those ease-ups might unfold are not guaranteed. So they're basically saying that it is guaranteed. They're saying the degree and the timeline are not guaranteed. Who the fuck is talking about a guarantee? No one should be talking about a guarantee. The only guarantee I can see right now is this thing getting worse. Because that's what the timeline shows. It's getting worse, not better. Anyway, and the current burden of infection remains unsustainably heavy. Long COVID still looms. Thanks for mentioning it. Quote, mild sicknesses can still leave people bedridden for days and take them away from school, family, and work. Yes, not to mention shrinking your fucking brain. And with reinfections now occurring more frequently. Oh, wait a minute. Reinfections more frequently. So how is that better? Like, this isn't what happens with the flu. I don't recall just getting the flu 3 or 4 times a year and, completely losing my sense of taste and smell or having chronic, significant attention and concentration, executive function impairment from the flu. But yeah, so the comparison is invalid. Anyway, individuals are each, quote, more often rolling the die that could make them chronically or seriously ill. Thanks again for mentioning it here in the second to last paragraph. Hodcroft of the University of Bern told me. In the Northern Hemisphere, that's all happening against the backdrop of summer. The winter ahead will likely be even worse. Yeah, because it always is. And with transmission rates this high, the next variant may arrive all the sooner and could, by chance, end up more severe. By chance, again, what's most likely? Is it on the off chance that the next variant will be more severe? Or is that more the likely scenario? Yeah. Quote, how much do we want to restrict our own freedoms in exchange for the injury that may be caused? Hodcroft said. Quote, that's something that Okay, first of all, social sciences are sciences. That's something that hard science can't answer. It's not that kind of question. It's a question of your values. And obviously, the United States does not value human life or well-being, except if you're rich. That's it. And right now, the rich need their system to continue because they're trying to compete against other arising imperial powers. They're trying to make sure that the working class does not mount a Bernie Sanders 2.0 that is more successful. They're trying to maintain the internal exploitation of the domestic proletariat. They're trying to exploit the whole world, really. And so they got a lot on their plate. Does dealing with the disease sound like a big priority? No. But it should be, and in a worker-run, people-centered society, it would be. But that's not the kind of society we're living in. It is the kind of society we would like to create. There's an unavoidable step of confronting capital and taking its power. This is what simply needs to happen at this point. That's why we're running a socialist channel, trying to educate and build the left. All right, so that's the first article. Again, it's from The Atlantic, not exactly the most progressive outlet there is. A lot of corrections and comments were necessary. So we still have 2 articles left. I was planning on doing the article on long COVID second, but actually I'm going to bump up the one about BA.2.75 first. It is shorter, and then we'll close with the long white paper on long COVID. So the title of this article is New SARS Coronavirus 2 Variant BA.2.75 Evades All Approved Monoclonal Antibody Therapies. Date is July 20. Author is William A. Hazeltine. We've done articles from him before. He writes for Forbes and does some really good science-y COVID articles. So let's get into this. Viral variation has proved to be a critical weak point in our approach to medical solutions for controlling COVID-19. Over the last 2.5 years, we've seen successive waves of reinfection by new variants of those who've been previously infected, those who have been vaccinated and boosted, and those who have been infected, vaccinated, and boosted as well. Behind this unfortunate dynamic is the dramatic variation in the structure of the virus exterior, specifically the spike protein, which plays a critical role early in infection by binding to the cell surface and forcing entry. Antibodies that recognize this surface can block infection. However, changes in the exterior structure negate antibody collections in convalescent sera and monoclonal antibodies from binding and neutralizing the virus. Pause. What did he just say? So antibodies are things that your body produces in order to basically neutralize antigens, which antigens are foreign things in your body that your body doesn't want there. It can be viruses, bacteria, something that you're allergic to. You can also have autoimmunity and autoantigens. These are things that if you have an autoimmune condition, your body recognizes parts of your own body as an antigen. Anyway, antigens are things that your body doesn't want there. Antibodies are what it produces to try to get rid of them. So, antibodies that recognize the structure of the spike protein, which is on the surface of the virus, can recognize it and block infection. However, changes in this exterior structure of the virus can negate antibody collections in convalescent, that means recovering, sera, this is basically people's blood, and monoclonal antibodies from binding and neutralizing the virus. Monoclonal antibodies, just like your innate antibodies that your body produces, are basically cloned antibodies. So if you are suffering a massive infection and you're taken to the hospital, they're not just going to rely on your body's own antibodies. They're also going to pump you full of cloned antibodies, basically helping your immune system to do what it would do on its own. So that's how this therapy basically works, the short version. What they're saying here is that this new variant, BA.2.75, is able to evade all the existing monoclonal antibody therapies. So if you get 2.75 and it starts overwhelming you, you go to the hospital, they can't give you the monoclonal antibody therapies that they have because it can just dodge them. All right. So that means that a major tool used to help hospitalized people can't be used on this strain. So, for all the people who complain about, anyone still talking about COVID because the mortality rate is, according to them, so low, well, this may dramatically increase it, actually, because when you get to the hospitalization stage, it's overwhelming your body. And the monoclonal antibodies is one of the ways that we prevent that hospitalization from becoming a death. Continuing. A recent study by Yamasoba summarizes the effectiveness of existing monoclonal antibodies against a successive set of virus variants, namely the BA.2 variant, which first emerged in late 2021 and quickly spread around the world, driving the most infectious wave of the virus to date. BA.4 and 5, which are the predominant strains circulating as of the time of this writing, and BA.2.75, a new sublineage of BA.2, which is likely more infectious and immune evasive than its predecessors, suggesting that it may become the predominant variant in the coming weeks and months. So basically in the study, they tested the effectiveness of existing monoclonal antibody therapies against these different variants. So here's a table summarizing all these things ending in MAB are the names of the monoclonal antibodies, and they show the effectiveness against BA.1.1, BA.2, etc. along the top of the screen. The ability of the virus to evade natural immunity from the previously infected and vaccinated is also reflected in its ability to escape a host of specific monoclonal antibodies. As is clear from Figure 1, the later Omicron family viruses evade monoclonal antibodies much more effectively than early strains. Immediately, we note that 5 antibodies, adintrevimab, bamlanivimab, casirivimab, etesevimab, and imdevimab, failed to neutralize any of the 3 Omicron sublineages. Casirivimab and imdevimab, as well as etesevimab and bamlanivimab, are designed to be used in tandem in an antibody cocktail, yet their combination antibodies were just as ineffective. So, commenting, those are put together and delivered simultaneously, but even the combination was also ineffective. Adintrevimab is intended for individual use, meaning that its neutralization potency for the strains circulating today is non-existent. These were among the first monoclonal antibodies developed, rationalizing why they're so ineffective against the more recent strains. This leaves 5 individual monoclonal antibodies: regdanvimab, sotrovimab, and, tixagevimab. What kind of sadist names these things? Did not neutralize the previously circulating BA.2 and the currently circulating BA.4 and 5. However, the 3 effectively neutralized the BA.2.75 pseudovirus. This suggests that if BA.2.75 became the dominant strain in the coming weeks and months, these 3 monoclonal antibodies could be effective treatments for those suffering from COVID due to this strain. Of the 2 remaining antibodies, silgavimab poorly neutralized BA.2 and BA.4 and 5, but was 24.4-fold worse against BA.2.75. Although bebtelovimab effectively neutralized BA.2 and BA.4 and 5, it was again much worse against BA.2.75, this time 21.2 to 25.6-fold. That is many times worse against BA.2.75. Despite poorly neutralizing BA.2.75 compared to BA.4 and 5, bebtelovimab still neutralized the strain better than any other antibody. Even newer generations of viruses recently detected in South Africa with more extensively mutated spike proteins, against which bebtelovimab and others may perform even more poorly. New variants evading monoclonal antibodies should come as no surprise. After infection, the convalescent sera of a recovered patient contains many antibodies designed to inhibit the virus that the host just overcame. For the virus to reinfect, it must mutate considerably to evade the convalescent antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies are effectively the same as convalescent antibodies on an individual scale. They're designed to overcome a virus by binding to specific amino acids on the spike protein. If the virus mutates enough, the monoclonal antibody can no longer bind to it. This is how the cat and mouse game of developing antibodies and the virus mutating has continued for 2.5 years. What then can be done? The search is on for monoclonal antibodies that recognize regions of the virus that are critical to the virus life cycle and therefore are resistant to most mutations. In other words, scientists worldwide are rushing to identify and develop antibodies with broadly neutralizing capabilities, i.e. antibodies that recognize highly conserved sequences of the spike protein that may overcome all viral variants. The good news is that many such antibodies have already been identified. We recently described the CV2.1169 antibody, discovered by scientists at the Pasteur Institute, and will continue to detail others as data are released. Whether these antibodies recognize and neutralize the latest variants, such as BA.2.75, remains an open question. A second potential solution is to use extensive combinations of functional monoclonal antibodies. While many fail to neutralize, some retain neutralizing capability against the latest variants, and new monoclonal antibodies are constantly advancing. Combining 2, 3, or 4 antibodies into a single treatment may suppress infection. Our hope remains high for monoclonal antibodies as a short-term relief for those infected, and in the long run, as a prophylactic against infection in the first place. So that's the end of that article. I feel like the last couple of paragraphs of that are getting a bit wishy-washy as far as hope and, it may do this and it may do that. The fact is, what we know so far is that the existing monoclonal antibodies are not nearly as effective against BA.2.75. A lot of them are basically worthless, so we're going to have to completely move on from that. So hopefully a few of the other ones, which have some effectiveness, will, are things that can be used. Otherwise, you're going to see a lot more of those hospitalizations turn into deaths. In other words, people get hospitalized, they get the treatments that have been used up till now, and those treatments just aren't effective enough to save the life of the person. So what is going to happen obviously remains to be seen, but, the more that this mutates, keep in mind that Omicron is the most significantly mutated form of COVID to date. It was kind of a quantum leap as far as not just a few variations, but it had the most number of mutations of any strain, and it wound up being incredibly effective at continuing to spread. So nowhere is it written that Omicron is the final word in COVID mutations. Just the contrary. We could, something that doesn't have a name now, that's on nobody's radar, has not emerged yet, could come out of the woodwork, and boom, suddenly we are dealing again with basically a new virus where the existing treatments don't really work as well, or even potentially, and this would be a horrifying scenario, but it is possible, something that needs to be considered, discussed, and prepared for, that really nothing that is currently used as a therapy works against it. So that's what he's talking about when he says the spike protein and sort of the outer surface is the most rapidly mutating part of the virus. It's sort of like, if somebody's hands or fingers kept changing shape, or their clothes, because that's what keeps getting snagged. And also they're not as essential to your life, but, your heart, really your body can't run for more than a few minutes without that. So if you have an antibody that targets that more vital part of the virus, then that's something that the virus can't really mutate as easily and still continue to exist. They say that they're working on it. We're 2.5 years into this. I guess we haven't seen it yet. So whatever happens with that, again, remains to be seen. I think that against the backdrop of rapid, uncontrolled, basically totally uncontrolled transmission, everything is up for grabs, and, it's kind of anybody's guess. The virus is unpredictable in terms of the ways that it actually is going to mutate. The basic logic of it, though, is fairly predictable. It will keep spreading, it will keep mutating, and then it's just a gamble every time that it does, every day that goes by without global containment and then vaccination. You're just wondering if today is the day where the 50% lethal variant arises. With the rate that variants are coming into and out of existence at this point, I mean, it's pretty rapid fire. So let's contain the thing. That would be the easiest thing. That way we won't be down to like 1 or 2 monoclonal antibodies that actually function until then it mutates again, and then nothing does. What would we do at that point? So these are questions, again, we don't want to find out the answers to the hard way. There will be a lot of human cost if we get into a situation like that where we are at least temporarily without any therapies. You know, people will figure out something eventually, probably, but will it take a day, a week, a month, a year, a decade? And what will happen as the damage racks up in the meantime? Again, not questions we want to find out the answers to the hard way, also questions we don't have to find out the answers to the hard way. However, as long as capitalism and its profit mandate remains central in our social systems, then, you know, stopping this virus is just not going to be a priority. The system really can't put profit aside long enough to deal with it. So we have to put aside the system long enough to deal with it. All right, let's move on to the third and final article here. Okay, so the title of this article, or rather white paper, which is a policy paper, research paper intended for public use basically, is Patients Diagnosed with Post-COVID Conditions, an Analysis of Private Healthcare Claims, using the official ICD-10 diagnostic code. This is by FAIR, F-A-I-R, from May 18, 2022. So first of all, what is this paper? So basically what they did, and they'll explain the methodology in it, I'm going to read the whole paper. Basically, there is a new medical diagnostic code, U09.9, which is used for, quote, post-COVID-19 condition unspecified. So this is about the closest thing to a long COVID diagnostic code that we have. And then this is the first paper that does a study on the people who got that diagnostic code, what else were they diagnosed with? So they looked at a 4-month window, October 1st, 2021 to January 31st, 2022. So it's pretty recent. And in total, there were 78,252 patients in this group with that diagnosis. So they looked at what else were they suffering from. Combined with other types of population health studies, this can give us a window into what else is going on health-wise. What are the comorbidities or also occurring sicknesses which may be caused by COVID-19, in which case they're called sequelae, which is basically a fancy word for consequences. So also, who is FAIR? Here is a paragraph from the end of the study about Fair Health. Fair Health is a national independent nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing transparency to healthcare costs and health insurance information through data products, consumer resources, and health systems research support. Fair Health qualifies as a public charity under Section 501c3 of the Federal Tax Code. Fair Health possesses the nation's largest collection of private healthcare claims data, which includes over 36 billion claim records, and is growing at a rate of over 2 billion claim records a year. Fair Health licenses its privately billed data and data products, including benchmark modules, data visualizations, custom analytics, and market indices, to commercial insurers and self-insurers, employers, providers, hospitals and healthcare systems, government agencies, researchers, and others. Certified by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, as a national qualified entity, Fair Health also receives data representing the experience of all individuals enrolled in traditional Medicare Parts A, B, and D. Fair Health includes among the private claims data in its database data on Medicare Advantage enrollees. Fair Health can produce insightful analytic reports and data products based on combined Medicare and commercial claims data for government, providers, payers, and other authorized users. So their websites are fairhealthconsumer.org and fairhealthconsumidor.org, and their main website is fairhealth.org. Just, basically they do research on insurance claims and things like that as part of overall research into the healthcare system. So let's begin. Summary. Post-COVID conditions, also known by such terms as long COVID and post-acute sequelae of COVID-19, you could also add COVID long haulers to that, have become an issue of growing national concern. Until recently, researchers were limited by the lack of a specific ICD-10 diagnosis code for post-COVID conditions. real quick, what is the ICD-10? The ICD is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems. Here you can see a screenshot from a page at the World Health Organization about the ICD-11. It's the 11th revision, the global standard for diagnostic health information, and it says ICD serves a broad range of uses globally and provides critical knowledge on the extent, causes, and consequences of human disease and death worldwide via data that is reported and coded with the ICD. So, it's a system of classifying diseases for exactly the kind of study that we're about to read here. All right, continuing. Effective October 1st, 2021, ICD-10 code U09.9 was introduced for, quote, post-COVID-19 condition unspecified. This report is among the first to use the U09.9 code for research purposes. Drawing on longitudinal data from Fair Health's repository of billions of private healthcare claims, this report studies the population of 78,252 patients in the repository who were diagnosed with this U09.9 code from October 1st, 2021 to January 1st, 2022. That population is analyzed by COVID-19 hospitalizations, age, gender, number of days from initial COVID-19 diagnosis to last post-COVID diagnosis during the study period, pre-existing chronic comorbidities, co-occurring diagnoses, and risk scores. So when they say drawing on longitudinal data, longitudinal studies are studies over time. So again, what they're doing is they're taking people who got diagnosed specifically with post-COVID-19 condition unspecified and analyzing it along a number of different demographics and other relevant pieces of information for statistical analysis. And here are among the key findings. 1, the majority, 75.8%, so more than 3 out of 4, of patients diagnosed with a U09.9 post-COVID condition had not been hospitalized for COVID-19. Among patients who presented with a U09.9 post-COVID diagnosis, 81.6% of females had not had a COVID-19 hospitalization, compared with 67.5% of males. So commenting, we don't know yet what the total number of females versus the total number of males was, but we do know that 81.6% of the females didn't have a hospitalization, whereas only 67.5% of males had not had one. In other words, a larger percentage of the male group had been hospitalized previously, and a smaller percentage of the female group had been hospitalized previously. Third, the age group 36 to 50 was the most likely to be diagnosed with U09.9 post-COVID conditions. 34.6% of patients with that diagnosis were in that age group. So as far as people saying, I'm younger, I'm healthy, whatever, actually, if you're in your mid-30s to age 50, you're in the most likely group to have the post-COVID conditions unspecified diagnosis. Fourth, females were more likely than males to be diagnosed with U09.9 post-COVID conditions. Females made up 59.8% of the population of patients with that diagnosis, while males made up 40.2%. By comparison, within the cohort of people diagnosed with COVID-19 in the Fair Health repository, 53% of patients were female and 46.2% were male. So commenting, we said before we didn't know what the overall breakdown was. Now we do, that about 60% of the population of patients with the diagnosis were female, 40% male, and that this is not the same as the overall representation of people in the Fair Health repository. The female percentage is greater than the male, about 54%, but it's not as high as the 60% that have this diagnosis. So for whatever reason, females are overrepresented here relative to the overall population. We'll maybe get into why that is possibly in this study. 5, of patients who presented with a U09.9 post-COVID condition, 30.7% had no identified pre-existing chronic comorbidities. So about a third of the people, in other words, did not have pre-existing chronic illness. So for about a third of the people getting this diagnosis, this was their first chronic illness. 6. The three diagnoses most commonly co-occurring on the same claim line with the U09.9 post-COVID diagnosis in patients across all ages and genders were abnormalities of breathing, that was 23.2%, cough, 18.9%, and malaise and fatigue, 16.7%. So as far as the people, getting this diagnosis of they have a post-COVID-19 condition unspecified, their specified conditions co-occurring were most likely to be number 1, abnormalities of breathing, number 2, cough, and number 3, malaise and fatigue. 7. In patients with a U09.9 post-COVID diagnosis, certain co-occurring diagnoses were more common in some age groups than across all age groups. So that previous one with the breathing problems, cough, and malaise and fatigue, that was across the entire group. But then if you break it down into age groups, different age groups have different most common problems. Continuing, for example, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in patients aged 0 to 12. What is multisystem inflammatory syndrome? We've covered it before in the COVID videos. Basically, it's just like it sounds. Multiple major systems of the body suffer pathological amounts of inflammation. This causes organ damage. A certain amount of inflammation is a normal part of immune response, but this is inflammation beyond those levels. Abnormalities of heartbeat in the age group 13 to 22. So if you're a teenager or early 20s, you are most likely to get some kind of arrhythmia. That's not great, considering you're going to need that heart for about another 60 or 70 years. And generalized anxiety disorder in patients 23 to 35. Okay. So that's pretty significant. That can be pretty debilitating depending on the level of generalized anxiety disorder. So if you're in your mid to late 20s to early 30s, that was the most likely co-occurring diagnosis. And then hypertensive diseases in the age group 65 and older. So that's high blood pressure. Point 8, other and unspecified myopathies. These are diseases that affect the muscles that control voluntary movement. Occurred in patients in the post-COVID population 11.1 times more often than in the same population prior to COVID-19. Wow. So getting some kind of myopathy, a disease of the muscles, was 11.1 times more likely for the people who had COVID than those who didn't. That is really significant. Next, pulmonary embolism. This is a potentially fatal condition where an embolism lodges in the pulmonary artery. What is an embolism? Basically, it's a clot that forms somewhere in the blood vessels, then detaches, becomes free-floating, and if it then lodges in the wrong place, it can completely block off a blood vessel. In the case of the pulmonary artery, this is a major blood vessel supplying blood to the lung. Lastly, quote, other disorders of brain, including post-viral fatigue syndrome and certain forms of encephalopathy, occurred 2 times more often, so twice as likely to get that. So final point, on average, in all age groups, patients with a U09.9 post-COVID condition had higher Department of Health and Human Services hierarchical condition category, HHS-HCC, risk scores after their diagnoses of COVID-19 than before. HHS-HCC risk scores identify which patients are likely to consume more healthcare resources and potentially incur more healthcare-related costs in the long run. So that's the end of the summary. Moving on to the background. Post-COVID conditions comprise a wide range of health problems that may occur 4 weeks or more after infection with the virus that causes COVID-19. The symptoms may be new, ongoing, or returning, and may even appear in people who did not have symptoms of COVID-19 when they were infected. So commenting, that's what I say, during the acute phase, those first 3 or 4 weeks, you may not even have symptoms, and you can still get brain damage and other problems. So the mortality during those first few weeks, that is not really the only thing we have to think about by a long shot. Post-COVID conditions are known by various terms, including long COVID, long-haul COVID, long-term effects of COVID-19, and post-acute sequelae of COVID-19 or of SARS coronavirus 2 infection, PASC. By the way, there are a lot of references throughout this entire document. I haven't included those in the screenshots here, but if you go to the original study, you can read all of the sites. Continuing. Commonly reported post-COVID conditions include fatigue, shortness of breath, cough, headache, loss of taste or smell, and cognitive or mental health impairments such as anxiety or depression. I'll add in there concentration, focus, and executive functioning problems, which are basically things involved with goal setting, planning, basically managing your life, that kind of stuff. That tends to be impaired. Also, sleep problems are pretty common. Anyway, continuing. Systematic reviews have found that the worldwide prevalence of post-COVID conditions in patients who have had COVID-19 is 43% to 54%. So that's very substantial. It's roughly half of people. Post-COVID conditions have become an issue of growing national concern. Dr. Kristen England, founder and director of Cleveland Clinic's Post-COVID Recover Clinic, has called long COVID the, quote, pandemic after the pandemic. In a memorandum on April 5, 2022, President Joe Biden tasked the Secretary of Health and Human Services with coordinating a federal government-wide response to the long-term effects of COVID-19, including the development of a national research action plan on long COVID. A national independent nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing transparency to healthcare costs and health insurance information, Fair Health began its contribution to the study of post-COVID conditions with a white paper published on June 15, 2021. Drawing on longitudinal data from its database of billions of private healthcare claims, Fair Health studied a total of nearly 2 million COVID-19 patients for the prevalence of post-COVID conditions 30 days or more after their initial diagnosis with COVID-19. At the time, Fair Health and other researchers were limited by the lack of a specific ICD-10 diagnosis code for post-COVID conditions. Since then, effective October 1st, 2021, ICD-10 code U09.9 was introduced for post-COVID-19 condition unspecified. Enabling the establishment of a link with COVID-19, the new code was not to be used in cases that were still presenting with active COVID-19, although an exception could be made in cases of reinfection with COVID-19 occurring with a condition related to prior COVID-19. One of the advocates of the new coding, the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, hailed it as, quote, a critical step for long-term patient care as well as for tracking and research purposes, unquote. The present report is among the first studies to use the U09.9 code for just such research purposes. Like the first Fair Health study of post-COVID conditions, this report draws on longitudinal data from Fair Health's repository of over 36 billion private healthcare claim records, the largest such repository in the country. In this report, Fair Health studies the 78,252 patients diagnosed with the U09.9 code from October 1st, 2021 to January 31st, 2022. This study analyzes that population by COVID-19 hospitalizations, age, gender, number of days from initial COVID-19 diagnosis to last post-COVID diagnosis during the study period, pre-existing chronic comorbidities, co-occurring diagnoses, and risk scores. Aside from its 2 white papers on post-COVID conditions, Fair Health has published 8 other studies on the COVID-19 pandemic. These studies have 1. Projected the costs of inpatient services for COVID-19 patients and reported on treatment and hospitalization costs. 2. Analyzed the impact of COVID-19 on hospitals and health systems, healthcare professionals, dental services, and pediatric mental health. Profiled COVID-19 patients and reported on risk factors for COVID-19 mortality. So, methodology for this study. Fair Health identified all patients in its longitudinal dataset who had a claim line with a U09.9 diagnosis code, post-COVID-19 condition unspecified, from October 1st, 2021 to January 31st, 2022. During this 4-month study period, there were a total of 78,252 patients with that diagnosis. This was the study population. Fair Health then reviewed the history of these patients to find their initial COVID-19 diagnosis and to determine 1. Their index date of COVID-19 diagnosis, 2. Whether they were hospitalized for their COVID-19 diagnosis, And I'll just add, we know that hospitalization greatly bumps up your odds of getting long COVID. 3, whether they were in the intensive care unit for their COVID-19 diagnosis. 4, whether they were on a ventilator for their COVID-19 diagnosis. And 5, how many pre-existing chronic comorbidities they had prior to their COVID-19 diagnosis, based on the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Chronic Conditions Data Warehouse, CCW, diagnosis categories. Fair Health analyzed the study population by such variables as age and gender. From each claim line that occurred with a UO 9.9 diagnosis code, Fair Health captured the co-occurring diagnoses on that claim line. In the same study population, Fair Health quantified the number of occurrences of the co-occurring diagnoses prior to the COVID-19 diagnoses. Fair Health calculated how many patients in the cohort had the diagnoses prior to their COVID-19 diagnoses, and how many of them had co-occurring with their UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnoses. This was used to form ratios of patients post-COVID to patients pre-COVID for each post-COVID co-occurring diagnosis. Fair Health measured the Department of Health and Human Services Hierarchical Condition Category, HHS-HCC, risk scores of patients in the study population. The risk scores were calculated for all claims up to 90 days before their COVID-19 diagnosis, pre-COVID HCC, and also for 30 days and more after their COVID-19 diagnosis, post-COVID HCC. This was used to calculate the average difference in risk scores before and after COVID-19 diagnosis. Limitations of the study. The data used in this report comprise claims data for privately insured patients who are covered by insurers and third-party administrators who voluntarily participate in Fair Health's data contribution program. Medicare Advantage, Medicare Part C, enrollees from contributing insurers are included, but not participants in Medicare Parts A, B, and D. In addition, data from Medicaid, CHIP, and other state and local government insurance programs are not included, nor are data collected regarding uninsured patients. This is an observational report based on the data Fair Health receives from private payers regarding care rendered to covered patients, and the report was not subject to peer review. So just to quickly comment that this was not subject to peer review, that makes sense. This is a white paper put out by basically this Fair Health think tank. It's not a published scientific study that goes through peer review, etc. As far as the limitations of the data that were included, basically the certain kinds of Medicare and Medicaid, other state and local government insurance programs not be included. Is that really going to sway the study? Well, to the extent that people in those categories, such as people who have Medicaid, CHIP, and other state and local government insurance programs, have different levels of overall health, which is possible being lower income, then maybe a little bit. Overall, though, I think, as far as limitations go, there's a lot of data that was used in this, which gives a reasonable cross-section of a lot of the population. So again, as a starting point, I think it's a very good one. Anyway, let's go on to the results. So first, and there's going to be a lot of graphics here, a lot of nice pictures to look at. So COVID-19 hospitalizations. Overall, in the Fair Health data from April 1st, 2020 to January 31st, 2022, 8.4% of all patients diagnosed with COVID-19 were hospitalized for their acute COVID-19 diagnosis. So almost 10% of people were hospitalized who were diagnosed with COVID-19. The share of patients who are hospitalized varied by age group. Obviously, you can see a clear trend there. The older you are, the more likely you were to have been hospitalized. 65 and older was almost 25%. 51 to 64, your odds were about 13.5%, 14%. If you were 36 to 50, your odds of being hospitalized about 7.5%. 23 to 35, about maybe 6.5%. And then down to about 2.5% and under for people 22 and younger. So why is this? Generally speaking, older people are sicker. You have accumulated more damage to your body in that time. Also, the body slows down. You don't heal as quickly. All kinds of things. So that tracks with what we would consider common sense. Continuing, this is the same diagram, by the way. Of patients diagnosed with a UO 9.9 post-COVID condition, from October 1st, 2021 to January 31st, 2022, 24.2% had been hospitalized for their COVID-19 diagnosis. This was nearly 3 times the percentage, 8.4%, of COVID-19 patients overall hospitalized for COVID-19 from April 1st, 2020 to January 31st, 2022. It should be noted, however, that the two populations differed, with the latter encompassing more individuals over a longer period. In addition, some of the non-hospitalized patients may have had a post-COVID diagnosis with a shorter duration, which would not be captured if it occurred well before the existence of the UO 9.9 diagnosis. This finding suggests that in the COVID-19 population, the risk of post-COVID conditions is much higher among those who are hospitalized than among those who are not. However, because the vast majority of COVID-19 patients, 91.6%, were not hospitalized, most patients with post-COVID conditions, 75.8%, were never hospitalized for COVID-19. Okay, so just to summarize that again, basically, if you get hospitalized for COVID-19, which is more likely the older you are, then your odds of getting a long COVID condition go up dramatically. This we know also from earlier studies. I covered one in the December 31st, 2021 COVID update. However, because many more people are not hospitalized for COVID than are, and the odds of getting long COVID, even if you're not hospitalized, are still pretty substantial, then the overall group of people with some kind of a long COVID condition were never hospitalized. That said, people who were hospitalized are overrepresented in the group of people who have long COVID. All right, continuing. Many previous studies of patients with post-COVID conditions have focused heavily on patients who are hospitalized. In one systematic review of 57 studies, 79% of patients studied for post-COVID conditions had been hospitalized for acute COVID-19. However, the studies in that review predated the UO 9.9 diagnosis code and therefore did not include it. A more recent study using that code found that 21.3% of patients diagnosed with UO 9.9 were hospitalized for COVID-19. Like the share of COVID-19 patients overall who were hospitalized, the share of post-COVID patients who had been hospitalized varied by age group. So again, every time they say post-COVID patients, that's somebody who has a long COVID type condition. Anyway, so here's a graphic for that. In all age groups, the percentage share of hospitalizations was greater for post-COVID patients than for COVID-19 patients overall. For example, 40.1% of post-COVID patients aged 65 and older had been hospitalized for COVID-19, compared to 24.3% of all COVID-19 patients in that age group. So just to comment, I think that this is a really interesting presentation so far using data that, not everyone has access to. So this is great. I also think, though, that a lot of these statements of the findings are not the clearest, or they could be presented kind of in a way that grabs you a bit more. So for this, figure 2, what are they saying? Well, the title is COVID-19 Hospitalizations in Patients with UO 9.9 Post-COVID Diagnosis by Age. So the previous chart, figure 1, was just everyone who got COVID and the percentage of them who were hospitalized for it. This chart is people who got COVID and also had the UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis or had a long COVID condition. And we can see that in every age group, if you wound up with the long COVID diagnosis, you were more likely to have been hospitalized earlier on. So again, there's that link between the hospitalization during the acute, the first month, raising your odds of getting the long COVID diagnosis later on, of developing that condition, link probably between it's a more severe infection up front, maybe more likely to linger. We're going to do articles on what causes long COVID. There's a lot of evidence for viral persistence, a persistent infection causing it. We'll cover that more extensively then. We've also covered it before. But basically, if you got hit harder to the point where you were hospitalized, you're more likely to have wound up with that long COVID diagnosis. Although many people who were not hospitalized also get the long COVID thing. So it's not exclusive to people who are hospitalized, but people who are hospitalized more likely to wound up. It increases your risk factor for developing the long COVID symptoms later on. Then figure 3, this is the average length of stay in days for COVID-19 hospitalizations in patients with UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis by age. We can see that these are all roughly similar. So what do they say? The average length of stay for each age group of patients who are hospitalized for their COVID-19 diagnosis and later had a UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis was fairly similar across the age groups in the range 13 to 50. The age group 13 to 22 had an average length of stay of 8.7 days, the age group 23 to 35, 8.1 days, and the age group 36 to 50, 8.6 days. For younger and older age groups, however, length of stay showed greater variation. The age group 0 to 12 had an average length of stay of 5.3 days, the age group 51 to 64, 9.5 days, and the age group 65 and older, 10 days. So I would say that some of these are probably due to hospital protocols. I mean, some of it is also going to be based on just how long the patient is measurably sick for, but the middle age range from 13 to 50, that's all about the same. Then as you get over 50 or over 65, your age may earn you an extra day or two stay in the hospital, and then people under 12 probably shave off 4 or 5 days. So there is some correspondence between people's age and how long they were hospitalized during that acute phase for their initial COVID-19 infection. And by initial, I don't necessarily mean that it wasn't a reinfection. I mean, in relation to the long COVID, this is, that first month of any given infection, whether it's your first infection or not. All right, continuing. Among patients who presented with a UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis, 18.4% of the female patients had had a COVID-19 hospitalization, compared to 32.5% of the male patients. Thus, 81.6% of females had not had a COVID-19 hospitalization, compared to 67.5% of males. So a little bit of sex-based breakdown here, and I don't know what this means, but it's certainly an interesting finding. That's a very significant difference, a large difference between females and males. Much fewer of the females who ended up with a long COVID diagnosis had been hospitalized, whereas about a third of males were hospitalized who ended up with a long COVID diagnosis. Now, is this men being less likely to seek treatment for long COVID symptoms? What is driving this? It could be a lot of things, but they're just presenting this raw statistic at this point. Continuing. Figure 5 below, which is titled COVID-19 Hospitalizations in Patients with UO9.9 Post-COVID Diagnosis by Age and Gender. So now we're adding age along with the gender as well. Shows the number of patients who had a UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis and a COVID-19 hospitalization within a certain gender and age group, divided by the number of patients who had a UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis within that gender and age group. Gender disparity varied by age group. So, in other words, that big disparity that there was on the overall stats for all age groups was not necessarily that wide in every individual age group as it got broken down. So it says in patients aged 0 to 12, similar shares of males, 5.3%, and females, 5.8%, had a COVID-19 hospitalization prior to their post-COVID diagnosis. So actually that's the only age group where a slightly greater share of females had the long COVID diagnosis. In older age groups, there was greater gender disparity, with males rather than females having the larger share of COVID-19 hospitalizations. Patients in the age group 36 to 50 had the greatest gender difference. 31.5% of males with a post-COVID diagnosis had been hospitalized for COVID-19, compared to 15.2% of females. So again, commenting, we know that overall being hospitalized ups your odds of turning up with this diagnosis, the UO9.9 diagnosis. And we've known that really before this code even existed. The question that pops up in my mind first is this something biological, where females are more likely, even without a hospitalization, to develop symptoms, or is it more that symptoms are experienced equally, but men are less likely to go and get the diagnosis or something like that? Anyway, the disparity is there, whatever the cause is. Continuing. Age and gender. So here we have figure 6. This is patients with UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis by age. So of the 78,252 patients from October 2021 to January 2022 who were diagnosed with a post-COVID condition using the ICD-10 diagnosis code UO 9.9, the largest share, 34.6%, was in the age group 36 to 50 years. The next largest percentage, 31.9%, was in the age group 51 to 64. The two youngest age groups, 0 to 12 and 13 to 22, jointly constituted just over 10% of the distribution. The finding about the age group 36 to 50 years is consistent with a study from the CDC showing higher odds of post-COVID conditions in persons aged 40 to 54. Other researchers have found generally that post-COVID conditions are more likely with increasing age. So just to comment on that quickly, you see that the prevalence in 36 to 50 and the 51 to 64 age groups is similar, mid to upper 30%. And then it drops significantly for the 65 and older. I'm wondering what that is, because in general, this is more likely with increased age. Is it that the conditions in more elderly people, 65 and up, it's less likely to be identified as being COVID related, possibly because of just more advanced age, more, existing conditions or pre-existing comorbidities. And it's not necessarily labeled as COVID, whereas if you're younger, you don't necessarily have as many, chronic degenerative conditions or, other just illnesses of old age. And so it stands out more as being connected with COVID. Not sure. Again, that's not included, at least in this part of the study, but I think an interesting question for follow-up. Anyway, moving on to figure 7. This is patients, the pie chart now, so it's proportional, with UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis by gender, October 21 to January 22. Females made up 59.8% of the population of patients with UO 9.9 post-COVID conditions, while males made up 40.2%. This is consistent with other researchers' findings that those with post-COVID conditions are more likely to be female. By comparison, within the cohort of people diagnosed with COVID-19 in the Fair Health Repository, 53.8% of patients were female and 46.2% were male. Thus, both COVID-19 and post-COVID diagnoses, or long COVID, were more prevalent among females. So females are overrepresented in both groups by the overall share of population. Continuing, this is figure 8, patients with UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis by age and gender. So this is the male versus female breakdown of all patients who had COVID-19, not just those who were hospitalized. Now, if I could just comment, I had to flip back to figure 5, which was the other gender breakdown. That was just people who developed long COVID who had been hospitalized. This is people who were not necessarily hospitalized. So, yeah, I think this could have been laid out like a little bit more logically. But anyway, this is people who weren't necessarily hospitalized, just everyone in all the different age categories, male versus female, who developed long COVID. So you can see the results there. The individuals aged 0 to 12. Percentage of males and females was almost the same, 50.5% to 49.5%. Patients 65 and older, very similar, 49% to 51%, almost equal. But in the middle age categories, the females outweigh the males pretty significantly in every age group, 51 to 64, down to 13 to 22. So moving on to figure 9, this is average number of days from initial COVID-19 diagnosis to the last UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis by age and gender. So the average number of days from the initial COVID-19 diagnosis to the last date in the study period on which the patient had a claim line with a UO 9.9 diagnosis did vary by age and gender. In almost all age groups, the average number of days was longer in females than in males. The one exception was the age group 13 to 22, in which males had an average of 141 days, compared to 136.7 days for females. That was the longest duration for males from initial COVID-19 diagnosis to last post-COVID diagnosis. For females, the longest duration was in the age group 51 to 64 years, 145.6 days. Note that this was the longest duration within the circumscribed study period. Post-COVID symptoms may have continued after that period. The average number of days was lowest in patients aged 0 to 12. In that age group, females persisted with post-COVID conditions an average of 82.2 days after their index COVID-19 diagnosis, and males an average of 75.2 days. So basically, if we're looking at how long does it take for long COVID symptoms to emerge and be diagnosed, this is roughly the time scale here. It takes a number of months. So remember, this is just when the diagnosis of long COVID was made. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily when the symptoms appeared or where they disappeared. It's just where the diagnosis got logged. Continuing on to Figure 10, pre-existing chronic comorbidities or pre-existing conditions in patients with UO 9.9 post-COVID condition, October 2021 to January 22. So pre-existing chronic comorbidities. Of patients who presented with a UO 9.9 post-COVID condition, 30.7% had no identified pre-existing conditions. The remainder had one or more. The smallest share, 13.2%, had one pre-existing chronic condition. 20.6% had 2 to 3, 14.9% had 4 to 5, and 20.7% had 6 or more. While Fair Health focused on patients who had UO 9.9 post-COVID conditions and had pre-existing conditions, the results resonate with previous research that made a similar finding. Individuals with pre-existing conditions were more likely to have long COVID or post-COVID conditions. So I will just say that, very many people over a certain age are going to have some kind of chronic comorbidity. If we add this up, the 0 and the 1 chronic comorbidity, you get almost half, basically 43.9% or almost 44% had 0 or 1, and then a slight majority had 2 or more, as you can see in the pie chart there. All right. Continuing on the pre-existing chronic comorbidities, here is an age breakdown, and then the colors represent how many. The purple is 0, and you can see that the number of zeros goes down with age. So basically, the older you get, the more likely you are to have more chronic comorbidities. So anyway, the distribution of pre-existing chronic comorbidities in patients with a UO 9.9 post-COVID condition varied by age group. Of individuals aged 65 and older who presented with the UO 9.9 diagnosis, 56% had 6 or more pre-existing chronic conditions, so a majority, the largest share of any age group. That was because this population in general has more chronic conditions than others. Conversely, the youngest age group had the largest percentage, 64%, with 0 pre-existing chronic comorbidities. Even in the population aged 23 to 35, 42% had 0 pre-existing chronic conditions. Co-occurring diagnoses, and we're on to Figure 12 here, 15 diagnoses most commonly co-occurring with UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis. So of the people who get a long COVID diagnosis, which is, quote, unspecified, what are the identifiable things that are going on? Figure 12 shows the 15 diagnoses most commonly co-occurring with the UO 9.9 post-COVID diagnosis in patients across all ages and genders. So if you've got long COVID, this is the stuff you're most likely to have as well. The leading diagnosis that co-occurred on the same claim line with UO 9.9 was abnormalities of breathing. It occurred in almost a quarter, 23.2% of patients with post-COVID conditions. Within that category, almost 92% had shortness of breath or dyspnea. the medical term for shortness of breath. So almost all, more than 9 out of 10 of the people who had abnormalities of breathing, it was specifically shortness of breath. So a quarter of the people who had this UO9.9 unspecified long COVID diagnosis were also diagnosed with shortness of breath. All right. Next, second place was cough, diagnosed in almost 20%, 18.9% of patients with a post-COVID diagnosis. Third place was malaise and fatigue, diagnosed in 16.7% of such patients. All three diagnoses have been widely noted as post-COVID conditions. Lower ranking, but still common diagnoses, included abnormalities of heartbeat in 10th place and sleep disorders in 12th place. Abnormalities of heartbeat have been noted as a post-COVID condition by other researchers, as have sleep disorders. We've covered this in a previous video on long COVID, healthy people having to get pacemakers, stuff like that. People who bike and run regularly are in good overall shape in terms of their cardiovascular system. Their heart gets hit by the infection to the point where their heart can no longer properly regulate its own rhythm. So just to read them off here, again, abnormalities of breathing, almost 1 in 4 also have that. Cough, almost 1 in 5 also have cough. And then malaise and fatigue, about 1 in 6 exactly also have malaise and fatigue. Down from there, hypertensive diseases were the 4th most common, so that's high blood pressure. Hyperlipidemia, so this is too much fat in your blood, so something like high cholesterol. Then pain in throat and chest, then generalized anxiety disorder, then asthma, then type 2 diabetes, then abnormalities of heartbeat, then overweight and obesity, then sleep disorders, then general symptoms and signs, then respiratory failure not elsewhere classified, and finally symptoms and signs, circulatory and respiratory system. Now, many people, even who aren't highly trained in statistics, may be familiar with the phrase, correlation is not causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean that one caused the other. So what you would want to do here is some additional analysis. For example, to see how the occurrence of these other symptoms occur in the long COVID group versus the general non-long COVID population. So continuing, here is figure 13, diagnoses within the category abnormalities of breathing, most commonly co-occurring with UO9.9, post-COVID diagnosis. And this is what they were talking about before. Within the category abnormalities of breathing, the top distinct diagnoses co-occurring with the UO99 post-COVID diagnosis were shortness of breath, which made up 47.2% of the category, and dyspnea, unspecified, which is also shortness of breath, or difficult or labored breathing, making up 44.4%. Wheezing accounted for 4.1% of the category, and snoring 2%. While it made up only 0.3% of the category, acute respiratory distress was also on the list. That is one of the most common ways that COVID does kill people. So, some of it persists into the long COVID group. Moving on to figure 14, here are diagnoses within the category malaise and fatigue, most commonly co-occurring with the long COVID. So this is kind of a breakdown of what's happening in that group. Within the category malaise and fatigue, which was the 3rd most common diagnosis co-occurring with the UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis, 54.3% of the diagnoses were other fatigue, and 27.2% were chronic fatigue unspecified. Then other malaise was 9.5%, and weakness 9%. So these are pretty hazy, and it sounds like people are getting this sort of general fatigue that is not falling into readily recognized categories, maybe something of a new disease or symptom pattern. I know that when I got COVID, I had horrendous fatigue, worse than I've ever had in my life. Came out of nowhere. I knew I was sick. I felt, hot and cold at the same time, achy. And one of the main things that was happening was around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, I would have to lie down and I wouldn't be able to get back up really for the rest of the night. And, I would rest for like an hour or two, and then I would start to get my energy back, and I would walk around for about 5 minutes. And that was as far as the energy went. I'd have to lie back down. This persisted for weeks. And then, I had ongoing, quote, other fatigue for quite a while. So definitely relate to this personally. And then you look at the weakness, which is about 10%. And I think tying that in maybe with some of the muscle problems that people are having is a possibility. But yeah, the fatigue is a major one. Then moving on to the category of sleep disorders, figure 15. This is a breakdown of that. Within the category sleep disorders, which was the 12th most common diagnosis co-occurring with the U09.9 post-COVID diagnosis, the most frequently occurring specific diagnosis was obstructive sleep apnea, making up 46.1% of the category. So this is kind of related possibly to the respiratory distress, because apnea is not breathing. So obstructive sleep apnea, a lot of people may be familiar with sleep apnea. It's when you stop breathing during your sleep. This can be related to snoring and can cause people to awake in kind of a panic, get really poor quality sleep. It's not good. Sleep is foundational for your health. Getting quality sleep is one of the most important things for staying healthy. It's when your body does the most healing and self-repair. And of course, it's important for your mind as well to process experiences that you have psychologically. So having that kind of interrupted sleep where you're repeatedly breathing and not breathing is not good. So anyway, next, insomnia accounted for 30.4% of the category. Sleep apnea made up 8%. Hypersomnia, which is excessive daytime sleepiness, was 5.4%. There's also sleep disorder unspecified, 7.7%, and then other 2.4%. So obviously the biggest two chunks are obstructive sleep apnea and then just insomnia, inability to fall asleep or to stay asleep. Now, figure 16, co-occurring diagnoses by age. So starting to break these down. In patients with a U09.9 post-COVID diagnosis who are aged 0 to 12, the top 5 co-occurring diagnoses, so that's what this is for this group, patients aged 0 to 12, differed somewhat from the top 5 across all age groups. In patients aged 0 to 12, cough was the most common diagnosis co-occurring with the U09.9 diagnosis, as opposed to being second. And abnormalities of breathing were in second place, as opposed to first. Most notably, multisystem inflammatory syndrome was in fourth place, even though it was not even in the top 15 in the older age groups, a condition in which different body parts can become inflamed, including the heart, lungs, kidney, brain, and others. Multisystem inflammatory syndrome has been documented, especially in children who have had COVID-19, though it can also occur in adults who have had that infection. And in children, it's referred to as MIS-C. The -C refers to in children. So now in patients aged 13 to 22 who had the long COVID diagnosis, the top 3 co-occurring diagnoses were the same as they were across all age groups: abnormalities of breathing, cough, and malaise fatigue. But further down, the diagnoses co-occurring differed: pain in throat and chest, asthma, and abnormalities of heartbeat. These included palpitations and tachycardia, that's a fast heartbeat. So one study found that young adults recovering from COVID-19 had changes in heart rate and sympathetic nerve activity compared to a control group of healthy young adults. So I mentioned before that some of the heart problems can be related directly to heart damage to the actual heart muscle. But, heart muscle, and also you have specialized cells in your heart that regulate the electrical contraction and stuff like that. But we also did an article in one of the earlier long COVID videos that was about COVID's affinity for the brainstem. Your brainstem has a lot of ACE2 receptors, which is the main route by which COVID infects cells, so it seems to have an affinity for the brainstem. Your brainstem controls a lot of autonomic functions, stuff that it's not under your conscious control. That may be another issue with some of the heart problems. And when I read changes in sympathetic nerve activity, you have 2 big systems. It's kind of a feedback loop: sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. One side of this will make you get excited, one side will make you get calmer. It varies in different organ systems throughout your body. But when I read that, I think I'm reminded of the damage to the brainstem that COVID may be doing. In other words, it's not just damage to the organs, there is that, but there's also damage to the control structures up in the brain. Anyway, continuing, now we have the figure 18 for patients aged 23 to 35. The top 3 co-occurring diagnoses, again, were the same as across all age groups. And as in the age group 13 to 22, pain in throat and chest and abnormalities of heartbeat were in 4th and 6th place, but generalized anxiety disorder was in 5th place, which is bumped up from 7th place across all age groups. Then you also have asthma in there. Then in the age groups 36 to 50 and 51 to 64, the top 5 diagnoses were the same or very similar to those across all age groups, which kind of makes sense, right? Because numerically, those groups are contributing the most amount of people who got a long COVID diagnosis. So continuing, in the age group 65 and older, however, there were differences. In this age group, hypertensive diseases most often co-occurred with this diagnosis, whereas across all age groups, they were in 4th place. So again, that may be more of a correlation than a causation, because that is a pretty common diagnosis. I'm a bit disappointed they didn't do more of that analysis in this paper, though I'm sure that somebody could take this research, including me, but I'm not going to do it, and do that analysis. Although, who knows, maybe I'll push myself to do it. But anyway, continuing, among patients 65 and older, hyperlipidemia was the 4th most common diagnosis, compared to 5th place across all age groups. Other researchers have found elevated age to be a factor in the development of hypertension as a post-COVID condition. So there may actually be some research linking the two in that case. So next, co-occurring diagnoses compared post-COVID to pre-COVID. For each post-COVID co-occurring diagnosis in the study population, Fair Health calculated the ratio of patients who had that diagnosis with a UO 9.9 code, i.e. post-COVID, to patients in the study population who had it pre-COVID. Table 1 shows those ratios for selected diagnoses not found among the 15 most common co-occurring diagnoses. So they do some comparison here. The ratios are not shown for the 15 most common co-occurring diagnoses because those diagnoses are likely to occur for other reasons prior to a COVID-19 diagnosis. For example, coughs may occur due to allergies. The diagnoses in Table 1 have been selected because they are generally uncommon, potentially serious, and show a large differential between post-COVID and pre-COVID. While not occurring in the same volumes as the 15 most common co-occurring diagnoses, they did occur in at least 200 patients. So there you have Table 1, selected post-COVID co-occurring diagnoses with the ratio of patients post-COVID to pre-COVID for this period, October 21 to January 2022. And top of the list, other and unspecified myopathies. So something is wrong with the muscle, and it's sort of in this general group of other and unspecified. The ratio of patients post-COVID to pre-COVID, 11.1. So kind of doing like a risk analysis, and roughly 11 times more likely to get that post-COVID than pre-COVID. Then other respiratory diseases, principally affecting the interstitium. Interstitial space is space between the cells, so affects that space, which is filled with interstitial fluid, rather than the cells themselves. Ratio of patients post-COVID to pre-COVID, 4.8, so almost 5 times. Then pulmonary embolism, very serious one, 2.6. Disturbances of smell and taste, 2.4. Other interstitial pulmonary diseases, pulmonary is the lung, 2.2. Other disorders of brain, 2. Pneumothorax and air leak, that's when you get air in the lung cavity but outside the lung, which, because it messes up the pressure, collapses the lung, 1.6. And other symptoms and signs related to cognitive function and awareness, 1.1. So an elevated ratio of patients post-COVID to pre-COVID in all those cases. So a few more comments. Other and unspecified myopathies, a disease that affects the muscles that control voluntary movement and that can cause muscle weakness due to dysfunction of the muscle fibers, occurred in patients in the post-COVID population 11.1 times more often than in the same population prior to COVID-19. Other researchers have reported myopathies in patients with COVID-19 or post-COVID conditions. Then, other respiratory diseases, principally affecting the interstitium, occurred 4.8 times more often after COVID-19 than before. The sole specific diagnosis in this category is acute respiratory distress syndrome. Then pulmonary embolism occurred 2.6 times more often after COVID-19 than before. This again is consistent with other literature showing pulmonary embolism in patients at the time of COVID-19 infection or afterward. So, brief aside here, COVID-19 as a cardiovascular and clotting disorder. So, some people have heard of COVID toes, also known as chilblains. So this is when people get kind of like a micro spotting type bruise pattern appearing in their extremities. And it is a result of microclots forming and blocking the capillaries, the connecting blood vessels between your veins and arteries in the fingers and toes. So clots is one part of it, other kinds of inflammation is another. But so this sort of clotting factor, making pulmonary embolism more likely. So what is that? Usually you get a deep vein thrombosis. Thrombosis is a clot forming in a deep vein somewhere. Usually it is below the waist rather than above it. And if it dislodges, then you have a free-floating clot. This is called an embolism. And as explained before, it lodges in the pulmonary artery that goes between your heart and your lung. That is really bad and potentially fatal. So again, COVID and clotting, important thing to remember. Continuing, other disorders of brain occurred 2 times more often after COVID-19 than before. So basically doubled your risk of getting some other brain disorder. The specific diagnoses included in this category are shown in Figure 20. Post-viral fatigue syndrome accounted for 65.8% of cases. Encephalopathy, unspecified, and metabolic encephalopathy, that is brain sickness basically, jointly accounted for 25.5%. Encephalopathy, any diffuse brain disease that alters brain function or structure, has been found to co-occur with COVID-19 and post-COVID conditions in the research literature. You don't want that. When we talk about COVID causing brain damage, is what we're talking about. All right, we're nearing the end here. Risk scores, HHS, HCC risk scores, are based on a risk adjustment model that uses the diagnoses and demographics of health plan enrollees to predict the risk of medical expenditures. The resulting risk scores identify which patients are likely to consume more healthcare resources and potentially incur more healthcare-related costs in the long run. In general, individuals with risk scores lower than 1.0 are regarded as relatively healthy. On average, HHS, HCC risk scores increased by 1.02 for patients with a UO 9.9 post-COVID condition, measured from before their COVID-19 diagnosis to 30 days and more after their COVID-19 diagnosis. An example of a risk score increase would be a patient who previously did not have a chronic condition and had an original risk score of 0.5, who now presented with asthma or another chronic respiratory condition that increased their risk score to 0.7. The difference would be 0.2. As seen in Table 2, the average increase in risk scores in patients with UO 9.9 post-COVID conditions varied by age. Even so, on average, in all age groups, patients with a post-COVID condition had higher risk scores after their diagnosis of COVID-19 than before. So COVID-19, in other words, made them less healthy, made them more likely to need medical resources. So the average increase in risk scores, none of these are negative, so everyone had an increase in risk scores on average. So in the 0 to 12 group, it was 0.16. In the 13 to 22, it was 0.43. It's pretty significant already. In the 23 to 35 age group, it was 0.73. 36 to 50, it's 0.84. Now, when you remember that 1, like 1.0, is regarded as relatively healthy, so, let's say your score was 0.8. Now you're going to add, on average, 0.73 or 0.84 to that. That's putting you well above the relatively healthy mark. Then the 51 to 64 age group, gain of 1.20. 65 and older, 1.80. So really substantially less healthy, substantially more likely to require healthcare resources. So before, when we were talking about the sort of, eugenics-minded, like, let the weak die or whatever, that's not actually how this works. If you get it, you're likely to survive, Like, you're more likely to survive than to die, but you're likely to survive as a weaker person with more health problems. So COVID does not cull the weak or thin the herd or whatever the fuck unscientific right-wing, fascist type people are thinking. Quite the opposite. It actually makes everyone less healthy and weaker. So yeah, instead of reducing the number of weak people in the population, it's actually increasing it. So much for that train of thought. Anyway, continuing. The conclusion: this study of patients diagnosed with UO9.9 post-COVID conditions in the first 4 months since that diagnosis code became effective makes several notable findings. Most patients with that diagnosis, 75.8% of them, had not been hospitalized for COVID-19. The proportion differed by gender. 81.6% of females had not had a COVID-19 hospitalization, compared to 67.5% of males. Of patients with a UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis, the largest share, 34.6%, was aged 36 to 50, and the majority were female, 59.8%. Nearly a third of the study population, 30.7%, had no identified pre-existing chronic comorbidities. The three diagnoses most commonly co-occurring with the UO9.9 post-COVID diagnosis in patients across all ages and genders were abnormalities of breathing, cough, and Malezin fatigue. Lower ranking but still common co-occurring diagnoses included abnormalities of heartbeat and sleep disorders. Certain co-occurring diagnoses were more common in particular age groups than across all age groups. For example, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in patients aged 0 to 12, abnormalities of heartbeat in the age group 13 to 22, generalized anxiety disorder in patients aged 23 to 35, and hypertensive diseases in the age group 65 and older. Some co-occurring diseases were less common but still occurred more often in patients in the post-COVID population than in the same population prior to COVID-19 infection. These included other and unspecified myopathies, muscle disease, pulmonary embolism, and other brain disorders. Overall, patients with the UO9.9 post-COVID condition had higher HHS-HCC risk scores after their diagnosis of COVID-19 than before. The findings in this report are important for all individuals diagnosed with UO9.9 post-COVID conditions, as well as for providers, payers, and policymakers. Additionally, Fair Health hopes that these findings will be starting points for further studies, including those using the UO9.9 diagnosis code. So that is the end of that, and that is our COVID update for now. I hope that this has been informative for you. We're going to be following this up with several other videos. I'm leading with these. This isn't to say that these are the 3 best articles, but it is a bit of an overview of what's going on, just to tease it a little bit. Overall, I plan to do another video just about long COVID, because there's really a lot that needs to be known about this. In that video, there will probably be at least 5 or 6 articles, I think. Then I want to do another video just about COVID and the immune system, specifically the T-cell dysfunctions that it causes. That may end up being a 2-part video because there's a lot of material about COVID, T-cell depletion, and other kinds of immune system, like base level immune system dysfunction caused by a COVID infection. Finally, I want to do another video about reinfection. Where do we go from here? The ways that we could change the healthcare system to better deal with this. How keeping schools open probably has been contributing. Well, not probably. How keeping schools open has been contributing to community transmission, etc., etc. So those are a few of the other 3 or 4 videos that I have planned. For the time being, we will probably be backing off the audiobooks a little bit. The good news is there are over 230 audiobooks on the channel, so if you want to hear those, I guarantee you have not heard all of them. Great time to get caught up, and you can check the home tab or the playlists tab for a lot of featured playlists for reading lists or lists by author or lists by topic of the various socialist audiobooks that are up on the channel. All right, thanks for listening. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so thank you very much for those. That support has enabled me to spend a lot more time on this per week and per month than I would have been able to do without it, so I very much appreciate that. Also, after the content has been produced and is live on the channel, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe, and comment. All of that helps to boost the content in the YouTube algorithm, and we'll recommend these videos to more and more people. The channel's been growing, and we want to keep it that way, make it easier, not harder, for people to stumble across this content. Finally, back in the real world, find an organization, find struggle that is active in your community, and get involved in it. You're going to raise your class consciousness by doing this, and ultimately we do have to get organized. Capitalism is in crisis, yet again, as it always does, and we've got to really end this system, but we have to get organized to do it. All right, thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video.